Chapter 6. Beating the Rap. Tom complicated matters about a week later by being hailed into police court. Without offering any excuses for Tom, it might be pointed out that he was an Irishman of strong prejudices, particularly against the British. Tom's mood had been black for several days because a nearby family had brought an English cook to Nantucket, and she had been welcomed into his group. From previous years, Tom knew most of the help in the houses near our cottage, and they'd meet in the afternoons on the beach. Partly because of his seniority and partly because he was always good company, Tom was one of the acknowledged leaders of the group. He was torn now between giving up the group altogether or accepting the Englishwoman. He was reluctant to do either. She was immensely stout, stately, quiet, and dignified. She spoke with a decided British accent and wore a light green, one-piece bathing suit, neither of which Tom approved. Tom would join the group on the beach in the afternoons, but sit as far away from the Englishwoman as possible. "This island is being ruined by too many limeys," he'd tell his friends loudly. "We're thinking of going someplace after this summer." If a good-looking young girl walked past in a one-piece suit, Tom would announce, "Now there is the kind that ought to wear a suit like that. The big fat ones ought to cover up all they can, or else stay home altogether." The British cook, who could take a hint, ignored him. Tom didn't want to be friends, but he hated to be ignored, and her snubs and accent had an accumulated effect of irritation. One day Tom got up off the sand and started for the water, just as the cook, who was standing, leaned over to unlace a sneaker. Her tremendous plump rear, hugged protestingly in the nether portion of the suit, emerged like a conch from a shell of her half-skirt. Tom almost butted into it. She seemed to be having trouble with the sneaker, and Tom contemplated the vast expanse with a loathing. On impulse, he picked up a sizable piece of driftwood and walloped her as hard as he could. The stick was wide and flat, and it met flesh with a sharp, resounding crack. The cook toppled over, ostrich fashion. Everyone, including Tom, was as surprised as anybody, too shocked to say a word. He stood there sheepishly with the board dangling from his hand, and for one of the few times in his life, he actually blushed. Both Frank and Bill, who were witnesses, swore to it. Finally, Tom dropped the board and helped her up. "I'm sorry," he told her. "Even for a limey, there ain't no excuse for that. I seen it there, and I don't know why I done it." The cook was expressionless as she slowly got to her feet, brushing sand out of her mouth and her hair. She looked right through Tom as if he didn't exist. "Ain't no excuse for it," Tom repeated. "First time I've ever done anything like that. Ask any of these people." She still didn't notice. "Here," said Tom, getting the stick. "I'll lean over, and you hit me. Hit me as hard as you can." He put the stick in her hand and leaned over, closing his eyes and hunching his shoulders to absorb the impact of the blow. When it didn't come, he straightened up again. The cook might not have gone to the police if he had let the matter drop right there and gone into the water and left her alone. But Tom, who was not in the habit of walloping ladies, was sincerely mortified and wanted to make sure he had apologized sufficiently. "Ain't no excuse for it," he said. "I seen you stooping over, and I seen the stick, and it's the first thing I knew." The mental picture of the stick making contact with the quivering flesh came back to him, and he exploded. "Hink, hink, hink, hink," he cackled. "I'm sorry, I can't help it. Hink, 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 hink." That carved it. Finally he got control of himself and started to apologize again, but the cook stalked away looking for the law. Tom was summoned into court the next day, and Frank went along to bail him out if necessary. The English cook was there, and so was most of Tom's group. "I'm guilty," Tom told the judge. "I ain't got no excuse for what I done." "Why'd you do it then?" "I don't know. She leaned over, and she was big and fat across there, and I almost walked into it by mistake, and then I saw a stick. Hink, 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 hink." "Go on," said the judge, who thought there was no time for levity, "and stop making the noise." "Hink, hink, hink, hink." Tom's laugh, although much too nasal to be pleasant, was infectious, and some of his friends joined in. "Go on," the judge demanded sternly. "Start from the beginning," Frank whispered. "You're laughing yourself right into jail." Tom backed up and tried again, but he could not get past the stick. Does he always do that? The judge asked Frank irritably. He never seems to get past the stick, Frank said. Hink, choked Tom. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but hink, 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 hink. $50 or 15 days, the judge said. Suspended on condition of good behavior for a year, and that you apologize to this visitor of our shores. I'm sorry, Tom told the cook sincerely. I honestly don't mean to do it, and I honestly don't mean to laugh about it. I won't let you off so easy, the judge said, except you've been coming to Nantucket for years, and you've never been in trouble before. I wouldn't have done it, Tom assured him again. Only she leaned over and... The judge rapped his gravel. Get him out of here, he said to Frank, before he gets to the part about the stick. Otherwise I might change my mind about suspending sentence. Occasionally, even years later, after everyone in the family was in bed and all the lights were out, we'd hear Tom chuckling through his nose up in his bedroom. And we knew that while he might be sorry, his regret was tempered with an intriguing mental image that would accompany him to the grave. The remainder of the 2 weeks before Mother's arrival went comparatively smooth. The economy budget stayed in balance. Ernestine had moderate success in improving the cooking. Martha looked swaddled, but eminently respectable in Mother's shortened bathing suit, and Tom didn't pick any more sticks up. There is no denying, though, that tempers were wearing thin. Anne's pep talks were beginning to sound hollow, and fights were increasingly frequent. A steadying adult hand was needed, and most of us realized it. There was one fight in which the whole family took part that started when Frank complained about the frequency with which Ernestine placed clam chowder on the menu. Ernestine was especially fond of clams. Not only that, but we got the clams for nothing by digging them ourselves. Frank could either take clams or leave them alone, preferably the latter. He thought that clam chowder, 4 times in a single week, was too much to take, even under the austerity program. Sometime during the climax of the argument, Frank picked up his bowl of chowder and inverted it over Ernestine's head. With clams dripped over her ears, Ernestine arose silently, picked up her chowder bowl, and repeated the process on Frank. Fish started to fly in a mass battle that pitted the clam lovers against the clam endurers. Anne finally managed to restore peace, but not until all the chowder bowls had been emptied. We didn't have a bathtub or a shower at the shoe, since Dad thought bathing in salt water was more healthful. So we all had to get on our bathing suits and go down to the beach to wash our hair. By then, having let off steam, everyone was in high, if clammy, good humor. There was considerable giggling, tripping, good-natured sand-throwing, and pinching as we ran down to the waters. The neighbors, not being stone-deaf, must have heard the threats of mutilation and death that had emerged a few minutes before from our cottage. In any event, they seemed astounded to see us all unscathed except for the clams and potatoes in our hair, and apparently on the best of terms. Anne deducted 20 cents from each of our allowances, which meant that some of the younger children didn't get any spending money for 2 weeks, and wasn't any repetition. Mother wrote daily, and her letters contained personal messages for each child. She couldn't hardly wait to see Jack swim, and she was mighty proud he had learned. She certainly wouldn't forget Martha's bathing suit when she passed through Montclair. Ernestine shouldn't worry about missing her college boards. It might be for the best anyway to take a postgraduate year at high school, and start college after that, when the family would be a little more settled. Most important of all, the talks at London and Prague had gone well, very well, she thought, and she had plans for opening a motion study school at her house in Montclair. All of us would be on the steps, waiting for Mr. Conway, the mailman, in the morning. There was a calendar with a red circle around Mother's arrival date, hanging on the chimney in the dining room. Each morning at breakfast, Lillian, who was in charge of the calendar, marked off another day. The morning before Mother's arrival, we washed and oiled the floors, waxed the furniture, polished brass, scrubbed windows, and trimmed the bayberry bushes in the front yard. Everybody, including Tom, pitched in, and when we were through, the house was cleaner than it had been in the beginning, is now, or probably shall ever be. We went for a quick swim, more for sanitary reasons than for relaxation, and then put on our best clothes. Everybody looked fine, even Martha and her hand-me-downs. Ernestine had brought a large roast for supper and spent a good part of the afternoon telling Tom what she intended to do to him and how she intended to torture his cat if he charred a single inch of it. It was the first roast we had had since we left Montclair. Lillian was at the station at the top of the taller lighthouse as a lookout for the Nantucket boat, and as soon as the smoke was visible, she let us know, and Anne lined us up in the dining room for final inspection. "Everyone's alive and whole," she began, just as Tom stuck his head into the doorway to see what was going on. "And nobody's in jail." Tom's head disappeared again. "So I guess we did a pretty good job." She cleared her throat and paced the floor in front of us. "You all know," she said in her best oratorical style, "that I don't enjoy making speeches." The first thing we didn't know at all, because there was few things Anne enjoyed more. Before she went to college, she'd been a mainstay of the high school debating team and drove her arguments home with such enthusiasm that her coach used to tell her she was supposed to merely stump her opponents, not read them. "Now that I'm about to relinquish my authority," she continued, "I want to thank you one and all for your fine spirit of cooperation. I would caution you about 3 things," she said, holding up the 3 fingers of her right hand and counting them off one at a time. "Don't reveal to Mother about 1, Tom being arrested, 2, the disgraceful clam chowder episode, or 3, Martha's wearing insufficient clothing to the beach the day we arrived." "What's she talking about, Fred?" Dan whispered loudly. "And why is she hollering and sticking her arms out like that?" "Search me, Dan," Fred whispered back just as loudly. "I'm talking about this," said Anne, forgetting her role as public speaker and leaning over so close her face was on the level of theirs. "If you tell Mother about Tom and the fat woman, or about the clam chowder, or about the day Martha wore the under half of Mother's suit to the beach, I'll murder you." "You mean?" asked Fred. "The day she was naked except for the black underwear?" "I like that," Martha protested. "That's just what I mean," Anne nodded. "Mother would die if she heard it." We started for the dock. Jane walked some of the way by herself, and then Anne and Ernestine carried her all together in a chair they'd made of their hands and wrists. We knew Mother would want to see us all when her boat pulled in. In a person's lifetime, there may not be more than 6 occasions that he can look back to the certain knowledge that right then at that moment there was room for nothing but happiness in his heart. The walk to the boat that afternoon was one of those occasions. The steamer rounded Brant Point, and we could begin to distinguish the passengers. "I think I see Mother," Lillian shouted breathlessly. "Where?" we asked her. "Where?" Lillian was too excited to tell us. "Mother!" she screamed and jumped up and down so that Anne had to grab her dress to keep her away from the edge of the dock. Then we all saw Mother. She was waving, and it looked as if she perhaps was jumping up and down a little too. She was still dressed in widow's clothing, but her coloring had come back. Perhaps it was just a trick of the wind, which was billowing her dress behind her. It may have accounted for the jaunty angle of her hat. But she seemed stronger and more sure of herself than we had ever seen her before. In a matter of minutes, the boat was tied to the dock, and Mother was coming down the gangplank, struggling with 2 suitcases. Martha wasn't the only one thinking about saving tips. People stood back and gave us room as we descended on her. First, it was a mass greeting, and we could tell she was picking each one of us out and checking us off in her mind. "It's so good to be home," she said. "I can't tell you how I felt when I saw all of you standing on the dock." We said it was good to have her home, with the younger ones hanging onto her skirts and the rest of us trying to get as close as we could. We started walking down the dock. "We believe you've all grown," Mother told us, "and all of you look so tan and well." "You should have seen us with the chicken pox," Fred said. "We didn't look so well then." "We were as sick as dogs," Dan agreed, "and we took castor oil too, Mother." "That was fine, Mother said absently. "I knew you would—" She stopped dead. "Chicken pox," she said. "What about chicken pox?" "Didn't we write you about that?" Anne asked innocently. "Mercy, Maud," said Mother. "You know perfectly well you didn't. Who had it?" "All of us," Anne grinned. "We got it the day you left." She turned to the boys. "You might have at least waited until Mother got home to break the news." "That wasn't one of the things you told us not to tell," Fred said defensively. "You didn't have anything else, did you?" Mother asked. Anne shook her head. "Anything else happen you didn't write about?" It was the only important thing, really." Mother reached out over the heads of Bob and Jack and squeezed Anne impulsively around the waist. Anne looked as if whatever she had been through in the last 5 weeks had been worthwhile. Ernestine personally supervised the final stages of the roast beef, and it was red and tender. There were candles on the dinner table, and we used the good silver. No holly was to be had on Nantucket, at least in the summertime, but we decked the halls with boughs of bayberry. Mother thought the roast beef was delicious, and made a point of complimenting Tom on it. "It ain't quite done as much as it ought to be," Tom told her. "We got a lot of cooks around here spoiling the cloth." "I'm afraid," Mother said to us after Tom retired to the kitchen, "that we won't be able to have roast beef as often as we used to. It'll be all right, won't it?" "We know it," Martha said. "You don't have to worry about it." "We're used to substitutes," Frank put in. "We'll have to rely a little more on less expensive things like, well, liver, cold cuts, fish, and clam chowder." "I love clam chowder," said Ernestine, glaring at Frank. "We'll have some of it real soon." "She eats it until it comes out of her ears." Frank smirked complicitly. Then, imitating Tom, he laughed through his nose. "Hink, hink, hink. I'm sorry for what I'd done, but hink, hink, hink." "What's the matter, dear?" Mother said. "Is something stuck in your windpipe? Hit him on the back, Bill." "Oh, there's nothing the matter with him," said Bill, who obliged anyway with all his might. "It's just the noise he makes," Anne explained. "Oh," said Mother, obviously relieved. "That's good. Only I don't believe I'll ever make a noise like that unless I had to, dear." Anne thought we were skating too close to both the clam chowder and the Tom and Stick episode, and was eager to change the subject. "I think it's time for Martha's surprise," she said. "What do you think, Mother? We spent only $300 of the money you gave us." "Why, you couldn't have," Mother replied. "The tickets to Nantucket must have cost. And Martha wrote she had forgotten her clothes. And the milk bill. You didn't sell anything, did you, dear?" "That was my surprise, you speechmaker, you," Martha protested. "You said I could tell her." "That's what I want you to do," Anne said. "You are in charge of the budget, so you're the one to tell her." "Yes, you tell me, dear," Mother nodded. "We spent $296.05, said Martha, who always knew the bank balance down to the last penny. "I don't know how you do it," Mother told us, shaking her head. "Why, if we keep going at that rate, I know everything will be all right." "We've been eating like kings," Ernestine put in. "I'd like you to help me run the house, just like you've been doing," Martha said. "And I'd like Martha to keep the budget. Goodness knows I could never manage money that well." "You'll have to make out a requisition form in triplicate when you want 2 cents for a stamp," Anne warned. "No, she won't either," Martha said. "Mother's an exception. She'll only have to make out 1 form, and I'll fill out the 2 duplicates." "Thank you, dear," said Mother, and she sounded as if she meant it. Mother had brought each of us a present. Not expensive presents, such as Dad used to bring when he returned from Europe, she explained. Just something to know she'd been thinking of us. She brought out the presents while we were finishing our dessert. There was check dolls for Jane and Lillian, Paris hats for Martha, Ernestine, and Anne. The girls' presents were a big success. But the boys had trouble hiding their disappointment when they unwrapped their package and found that each contained a blue beret. "All the men in France are wearing them," Mother said. "I thought you might like to start the style over here." "Ah, they're just what we've always wanted," Frank said, stoutly, trying to banish from his mind what might happen if him and Bill wore the berets to school. "Berets, I guess," said Mother. "I don't know as much about getting presents for boys as your father did." "That's something I'm going to have to learn, isn't it?" "Ah, Dad never brought anything better," Bill protested. "Just old stuff like knives and watches." "You're good boys," Mother said. "I'll remember out old stuff like that if I go away again." Martha asked if Mother had intentions to bring the bathing suit from Montclair. Had remembered. Mother shook her head. "I had some business in New York, and I couldn't spare the time to go to Montclair. So I picked you up a suit at Macy's instead." She handed Martha a package. "If it comes below my knee," said Martha, fumbling with the wrappings, "can I take a hem in it?" "Goodness, it won't come below your knees," Mother laughed. "It's a 1-piece suit." "1 piece?" Anne and Ernestine shouted together. "No girl wears those old-fashioned 2-piece suits anymore, do they?" Mother asked. "We do," said Ernestine. "Remember Dad's rules?" "Modesty," Anne recited flatly. "Skirts at least to the knees, black stockings, and a minimum of skin showing." "Times change," Mother told him, And your father would have changed with them. In most things he was a good bit ahead of his time. I'll admit he stayed pretty far behind when it came to how his daughter should dress. Martha held up the suit. It was light blue and had a low-cut neck. If you say, "On your mark, get set, go," to me, Ernestine told her, "I'll scratch your eyes out." You'll have to beat me to them, said Anne. Besides, my fingernails are longer. Martha looked at the two older girls, and there was sympathy in her glance. I wonder if the budget couldn't stand for new suits for Anne and Ernestine, she asked. Those old maids would be too modest, Frank put in. The two girls didn't say anything, but they looked at Mother. I believe the budget can stand a knife for each of the boys, Mother said. But I don't think we need any more bathing suits. Then she handed Anne and Ernestine each a package, like Martha's.